The Caligari expanse had been awound in the galaxy long before anything noticed it bleeding again, a silent graveyard of dead forge worlds, broken void lanes, and derelict ships drifting like tombstones in the dark, so shunned that no astropath risked singing through its warp-torn shoals and no navigator dared trust charts that always came back wrong, if they came back at all. But on the 7th day of the month designated terror in the 41st millennium, reality in that forsaken region, folded like rotten cloth and something older than the Imperium pushed through. It did not arrive in a blaze of warp fire or a shrieking demon storm, but as a single point of absolute absence, a hole in existence so complete that light bent inward, died, and the warp itself recoiled like living flesh from a gangrenous lesion, and from that perfect darkness stepped a figure who had defied death in another universe entirely, a lich lord whose legend was carved into the bones of countless worlds. Vecna, the undying king, the whispered one, the god-killer who had made a habit of toppling pantheons and rewriting the rules beneath their dying feet, now setting his withered boots upon the bridge of a long-dead Imperial Navy cruiser named the Indomitable Wrath, its crew mummified at their posts for 2 centuries, skulls frozen mid-scream, hands locked to controls as though still waiting for orders from a god-emperor who had forgotten them. Vecna moved through that corpse garden with the unhurried curiosity of a scholar walking ancient stacks. His tattered robes flowed between crimson and shadow, his single remaining eye burned with cold, calculated intelligence, and where his skeletal hand brushed a skull-helmed officer, memories spilled into him, gunmetal trenches under ash-choked skies, the bite of recaf on a tired tongue, the crack of lost fire, the taste of fear disguised as faith, whispered prayers to a corpse on a golden throne that never answered. And as he sifted through those fragments he recognized, with something very close to amusement, the texture of this universe's power. The warp, a dimension of raw thought and emotion, souls stripped of flesh and given terrible form. A sea not unlike the cosmic madness he had once called the Weave, yet bent by different rules and possessed by ravenous gods whose names were written in blood and despair. He tested the air, flexed his skeletal fingers, and necrotic energy crackled like dying stars between bone-white knuckles. In his other hand, the eye that bore his name pulsed, seeing past, present, and possible futures stacked atop one another in nauseating simultaneity, and as he gazed through it he saw a galaxy in ceaseless war, where death came on an industrial scale and souls were fed to thrones, gods, and insanity with equal indifference. It was, he decided, the best kind of playground. One that already understood that nothing lasted forever. When he raised his hands, the Indomitable Wrath shivered. 2 centuries of stillness broke as the mummified crew jerked upright like marionettes whose strings had just been seized by a new master, their dried tendons creaking, empty sockets flaring with sickly green light as consciousness not their own flowed into them, and Vecna smiled, not with joy, but with the cold satisfaction of an accountant discovering a forgotten vault of assets. Across the expanse, those first stirrings were felt as a psychic anomaly, a choir of dead voices murmuring in unison, and aboard the Adeptus Sororitas strike cruiser Light of Martyrs, Sister Superior Meridel Vaughn paused mid-litany as a breathless surf crashed into the armory chapel where she stripped and anointed her bolter with ritual oils. Meridel was carved from faith and war, her scarred face as severe as the white shock of hair that proclaimed her lineage to martyred Saint Avalara, and for 40 years she had burned heretics, witches, and traitors in the Emperor's name, leaving a trail of charred worlds and broken cults in her wake. So when the astropath reported that the voices of the dead are singing, and that they chanted coordinates in perfect harmony, her first response was not fear but a hard, cold suspicion that something blasphemous was trying to rewrite the Emperor's order in the astropath's amniotic chamber. She watched a hollow map blossom above the withered Psyker's tank, warp currents rendered as spirals of light, and at their heart a single pulsing point of green corruption from which threads spread like veins, each anchored to derelict vessels and forgotten stations. And as the astropath whispered that 14 ghost ships had awakened in a single week and were now orienting toward that center, Meridel's tactical instincts screamed, This was not the usual chaos incursion. No mindless demon tide, but something disciplined, deliberate, building. An empire one corpse at a time. So she did what a good servant of the Imperium must. She armed herself, summoned her veteran kill team, and ordered a reconnaissance that could easily become a martyrdom. The Thunderhawk's descent into the expanse was a gauntlet of gravitational anomalies and warp echoes that made the gunship's machine spirit keen prayers to the Omnicia, but sister pilot Vasha coaxed it through with grim skill and binary litanies, until the indomitable wrath emerged from the poisoned nebulae like a drifting cathedral of steel, surrounded by smaller ships clustering like penitents around a shrine. As the gunship closed, Auspex registered movement where there should be none, figures shambling along hull plating in hard vacuum, stripping panels, rerouting power, rearranging corpses with methodical purpose. And when the Thunderhawk's assault ramp crashed open into the primary docking bay, Meridel strode out into a sight that froze even her battle-hardened heart. Thousands of dead in perfect ranks, Navy ratings, armsmen, tech priests, Imperial guardsmen from regiments whose livery she could not name, all mummified by void exposure yet standing at attention as if awaiting inspection, while at the far end of the cavernous space, on a raised platform, stood a tall skeletal figure whose outline fought her autosenses, a tatter-robed monarch with a single burning eye and a presence that pressed against her soul like cold fingers. When he greeted them as sisters, and spoke not through the air but in the resonant bones of their skulls, Meridel answered with the only language she knew, formal denunciation and a bolt round sanctified in the Emperor's name. But the miracle of Imperial engineering stopped in mid-flight, held inches from Vecna's chest by invisible force, then turned back upon her like a lazy accusation, detonating where she had been an instant before. Bolters roared, chainswords screamed, and thousands of corpses surged forward as one, their lack of fear turning them into an inexhaustible tide. Grenades vaporized dozens only for shattered limbs to drag themselves onward. And in the melee Meridel learned the first hard lesson of this new enemy, that conventional attrition meant nothing when the foe could simply reassemble its losses. In the midst of that storm, Vecna barely moved. When he finally raised his hand, reality hammered Meridel's mind, splitting her into shards of overlapping futures and deaths, burning, freezing, falling, rising again as his puppet. And for a heartbeat, perhaps for 10,000, she hung on the edge of surrender. But faith honed across decades flared, a white-hot core of stubborn belief that the Emperor's will could not be usurped, and she roared her creed into the psychic onslaught until the visions shattered like stained glass under artillery fire. Bleeding from eyes and ears, dragging a broken sister by her harness, she ordered a fighting retreat, every step bought with bolter shells and a growing pile of dismembered corpses that refused to understand the courtesy of staying dead. And as the Thunderhawk lifted away under cannon fire that chewed the undead horde, she glanced back one last time to see Vecna still standing on his improvised throne, a static silhouette in a sea of moving dead, his eye locked on hers as his voice drifted directly into her thoughts. "Run, little warrior. Spread word. Tell your masters that Vecna has come to claim what all empires owe to death. Everything." That message, carried not only by her report but by the ripples Vecna's arrival made in the warp, did not go unheard. In the Plague God's Garden, on a world of rot and ecstasy and corruption, a Death Guard sorcerer named Covarial Threx, who had strode the stars since the Horus Heresy and worn 10,000 years of pestilent glory as casually as a cloak, felt a new note in the symphony of decay, a necrotic pattern that smelled of death without rot, entropy without the blessing of Nurgle's cycles, and his cyclopean eye widened with both insult and fascination. To a Chaos Space Marine who had long accepted that all things fed the dark gods in the end, the notion that some upstart might command death in a way that bypassed the warp's tithe was not merely heresy but existential theft. And so he gathered a small plague fleet, rust-scarred cruisers trailing smog and demon flies, and translated into the Caligari expanse to investigate what he still assumed, in the arrogance of the long-damned, would be some mortal necromancer ripe for either recruitment or dismemberment. Reality corrected him with brutal efficiency. His boarding torpedo bit into the indomitable Wrath's flank, disgorging plague marines and chanting cultists into frost-rimmed corridors lined with still, watching corpses. And when a disembodied voice informed them that they trespassed in my domain, and would be added to my collection, unless they spoke their purpose wisely, Kovariel's champion made the standard Death Guard offer. Alliance and decay under Grandfather Nurgle's rot-caked hand. Vecna's response, appearing out of nowhere as if reality had edited him in, dismissing Nurgle as a god content to rule flies and filth, and then casually reducing that hulking champion to a drifting outline of ash by tearing his existence down past atoms to concept and finally to nothing, marked an escalation the plague god servants were not prepared for. Bolter storms stopped mid-air and were rewound into their barrels to explode in their owners' hands. Plague marines had their corrupted biology turned against them in precise cascades of organ failure, and the mortal cultists, whose souls had already been bartered away in 1,000 maggot-ridden rites, discovered too late that whatever magic Vecna wielded did not consider prior contracts binding. When Kovariel felt the souls of his warriors snuffed not into Nurgle's embrace but into non-existence, he realized with cold clarity that this lich was something other than demon, psyker, or xeno-sorcerer, a being who had found a way to exist eternally while owing nothing to gods, saints, or the warp's howling economy of worship and fear. That realization ignited both rage and awe, and in typical Death Guard fashion he answered by attempting to smother the problem in bodies, launching a full-scale boarding assault with hundreds of plague marines, thousands of cultists, and plague bombs whose pathogens had ended civilizations. But again the rules he lived by betrayed him, for Nurgle's gifts needed living flesh to corrupt and the defenders were already dead, animated by a form of necrotic energy that seemed to run parallel to the warp rather than flowing from it. Flies found no food in mummified muscle, plagues spread but discovered nothing that metabolized, and for every chaos warrior that fought his way through disciplined ranks of corpse soldiers, another died and rose moments later under Vecna's command, their corrupted souls overwritten by an alien will that did not ask, only took. When Kovariel himself finally teleported into the command deck, clad in Terminator plates scarred by ancient sieges, surrounded by a cadre of his best, he stepped not into a standard bridge but a throne room of frost and bone where the dead stood at attention like an honor guard and Vecna sat upon a seat forged from fused metal and skeletons, his presence bending local reality at the edges like heat haze. The exchange that followed was not merely a duel of powers but a philosophical confrontation between two visions of eternity. Kovariel proclaimed the inevitability of decay and the truth of returning to the cycle of rot, while Vecna answered that cycles were cages, gods were parasites, and that true divinity lay in refusing to bow, in becoming a law unto oneself. When the Death Guard sorcerer unleashed every plague and curse he had ever hoarded, enough pestilence to blacken a hive world's skies, it slid off Vecna like water off stone because there was no life there to corrupt, no cell to infect, only a corpse sustained by self-authored laws of necromancy older than any chaos god in this reality. Then Vecna spoke a word in a language this universe had never heard, and the Terminator Guard froze and died where they stood, their souls shredded before the warp could claim them, while Kovariel, wrapped in a labyrinth of wards and blessings centuries in the making, was peeled apart layer by metaphysical layer until even the mortal core he had once been was annihilated, leaving Nurgle's garden shuddering at the loss of a favored servant and the unsettling discovery that something now existed, which could deny even a god its due. For Vecna, Kovariel's death was not a victory to gloat over but another acquisition. By touching the ruin of that armor, he drank memories of demon names, warp currents, siegecraft, and the spiritual topography of the Eye of Terror, adding those to his growing library, and then he did something no Chaos Lord had ever done. He took the dead spread across his fleet and bound them not as mindless puppets but as nodes in a vast necromantic network, each corpse brain repurposed into a psychic amplifier, each trapped soul wired into what amounted to a hive mind of undeath stretching across the expanse. with his consciousness as its central command. The Caligari expanse began to change from graveyard to organism, a structure of ships and stations reconfigured into the limbs and organs of an unliving empire whose growth rate could be measured not in births but in body counts. Meridel saw only the shadow of that transformation in the glowing symbols of astropathic reports. More ships awakening, more derelicts falling under necrotic control, energy signatures growing stronger and more coherent as if the warp itself was being given an architecture. She also saw something else. A Death Guard fleet smashed, its champion erased, and realized with a cold sinking certainty that the usual strategy of letting chaos and other horrors kill each other then burning whatever remained would not work here because each new death was a recruitment drive for Vecna. At the edge of doctrine and desperation, she did the unthinkable. She sent messages not only to the Inquisition, the Navy, and nearby Astartes chapters, but also on frequencies Imperial law declared heresy, reaching toward Eldar corsairs who raided the sector's trade routes, gambling that fear for their own souls might make them listen. The galaxy responded in fits and starts. In the segmentum command structure, petitions for fleets crawled through clogged arteries of bureaucracy, while Inquisitor Malachi Horvastus of the Ordo Malleus read Meridel's first report, noted phrasing like soul obliteration and independent necrowarp matrix, and decided he would rather scorch 100 systems than allow such a being to metastasize. Horvastus was not a gentle man. Most Inquisitors aren't, but he had burned worlds where children still played in hab blocks because a single demon cult survived somewhere in the Underhive, and though his augmentic face betrayed little, his soul had long ago learned to weigh billions of human lives against abstract concepts like strategic stability and spiritual integrity. So when his fleet, a dozen cruisers, escorts, and a hulking battleship whose very presence warped the Sea of Souls, translated into the Expanse and his augur officers reported 97 necrotic vessels centered once again on the indomitable wrath, he did not speak of negotiations or containment. He addressed every crewman through the Vox, declared Vecna an affront to the Emperor's design, and authorized exterminatus on his own authority before the first shot was fired. What followed was a void engagement that would have entered naval academies as a case study had anyone survived it sane. Imperial lance batteries speared the dark, flash vaporizing undead ships whose shields still obeyed conventional physics, while from Vecna's fleet coiled arcs of sickly green warp lightning that overloaded void shields and cooked crew in their compartments. Boarding torpedoes filled with corpse soldiers punched through hulls and disgorged enemies who did not breathe, did not panic, and did not register pain, and Imperial armsmen responded with practiced brutality, sealing bulkheads, venting compartments, and incinerating entire decks rather than let a single breach spread. The math of slaughter was almost even, but even was not enough for Horvastus. When he saw that the indomitable wrath still held, its void shields distorting under a storm of fire but refusing to break, and when he felt the first tendrils of Vecna's psychic assault slithering across his own mind, showing him visions of his ship torn apart, of his acolytes rising as necrotic thralls, of a future where the Inquisition's sigils were carved into bone and worn by the dead, he ordered the unlocking of cyclonic torpedoes, weapons of such apocalyptic yield that they were normally reserved for punishing planets, not ships. Those torpedoes, 3 specks of rolling annihilation, streaked toward the indomitable wrath on columns of burning plasma, their machine spirits singing hymns of absolute erasure, and though Vecna could not reach into their sanctified cores, he could reach around them. With an almost disdainful flick of the hand that bore his name, he tore a hole in space that was not a demonic rift but a piece of pure geometry, bending the coordinates of his fleet so that, in the instant before impact, 97 ships were no longer where the torpedoes thought they were. The cyclonics blossomed like newborn stars in the empty void, taking 9 Imperial ships that had been locked in close combat with dead vessels that no longer existed, and Horvastus, watching entire crews vanish in a flare of holy fire that achieved nothing, realized he was facing something that did not just exploit the warp but understood the underlying rules of reality well enough to edit them. That tactical defeat disguised as partial victory forced him into a place he loathed: cooperation. While his surviving vessels withdrew to regroup and his tech priests dissected sensor records, he summoned Meridel to account for her initial contact and the Eldar overtures she had already made, and though he threatened, judged, and weighed her every word, he eventually found himself repeating a conclusion that tasted like poison. Vecna was not a localized heretic problem but a cross-factional extinction threat, one that would harvest Eldar souls as readily as human ones and whose expansion could only be slowed, not stopped, by conventional means. When Eldar Corsair Prince Uraith Kalos, sleek, disdainful, and deathly amused, accepted a meeting on a dead moon, what took shape between the Sister Superior, the Xenos Raider, and the human Inquisitor was not trust so much as a threefold admission of fear. The Eldar's Farseers had seen futures where the sector became a necropolis within a standard year. The Inquisition had felt a soul vanish so completely it left a bruise in the warp, and Meridel had looked into Vecna's eye and felt herself almost become his slave. They agreed, with all the warmth of predators circling something worse than themselves, that for once, their shared hatred of undeath outweighed their hatred of each other. The first joint operation proved both the potential and the limits of such alliances. Striking at the Corvin Belt, where abandoned ore processors floated amid asteroid clouds rich in raw material and, more importantly, frozen corpses, they launched simultaneous raids. Sororitas kill teams and Eldar strike specialists inserting through drop pods and webway gates, moving through rusted industrial cathedrals now repurposed into necromantic factories where the dead labored without complaint to assemble psychic transmitters designed to extend Vecna's control across light years. In Corvin 7, Meridel's boots rang on metal stained by ancient oil and fresh frost as she led Sisters and Corsairs through the cavernous main hub, bolter bursts and shuriken storms hammering corpse workers that moved without flinching, while Eldar blades flickered in lethal arcs and melta charges were slapped onto structural choke points. The transmitter they found rising from the floor was an obscenity of cables, imperial cogitators, and impossible glyphs that made eyes water when stared at too long, and as Uraith's power sword bit into its core and dropped it in a shower of green sparks, a dozen corpses at the edges of the chamber spoke with Vecna's voice, informing them that they were clever, predictable, and ultimately irrelevant. When a towering amalgam of stitched-together bodies clawed its way up from beneath the shattered device, a composite warrior whose arms were ogren thick, whose torso bore corrupted Astartes plate, whose legs were reconfigured servitors welded into a monstrous gate, the alliance was tested in the worst way, under pressure. Sister Jira was swatted across the hall like a toy, ribs shattering under the force, Eldar blades skated across necrotic reinforcement that had no living nerves to sever, and only a combination of Uraith clinging to the creature's back with preternatural grace while Meridel carved through its knee with a roaring chain's word finally tore apart the nexus of necrotic energy anchoring it, sending its components crashing down as separate corpses. The melta charges detonated seconds later, collapsing the hub and burying hundreds of the dead under molten slag. Elsewhere, on Corvin 3, another facility burned, but Corvin 9 became a charnel house where resistance proved too thick and the price in Eldar and Sororita's lives too high, forcing a bloody retreat. For Vecna, those losses were not defeats but data, each destroyed transmitter and slain amalgam feeding adjustments into his calculations. He observed the raids through 1,000 corpse eyes, noting the timing of webway openings, the ballistic signatures of bolt weapons, the rhythm of Eldar swordplay, and in the quiet depths of the indomitable wrath he refined his designs, perfecting the neural lattices of dead psychers who no longer burned out when touching the warp, tuning his hive mind of the dead to respond faster, hit harder, adapt to threat like a learning algorithm that ran on souls instead of code. In his private study, once a strategium, now lined with salvaged data slates, chaos grimoires, and Eldar crystal memories, he walked among silently working corpses who sorted knowledge into patterns as the warp flickered outside the hull like a storm seen through thick glass, and he contemplated, with genuine fascination, the philosophical implications of what he was building. a civilization that did not depend on birth, culture, or belief, one where death was not an end or a transition to divine service but a transfer of assets from self to central authority, from individual chaos to unified will. The gods of this galaxy he knew now were sloppy accountants, wasting potential in afterlives of torment or in a throne that devoured 1,000 psychers a day just to maintain the status quo. He, by contrast, would waste nothing. The question, as always, was whether the living would allow him the time to prove his superiority. They tried not to. Horvastus, teeth set in a rictus line, agreed to coordinate with Eldar raiders under more formal terms. Astropaths strained themselves to the edge of sanity, carrying warning after warning to distant sectors, and Meridel's kill team became the hard spear point of a growing, uneasy coalition of humans and Xenos who understood that if Vecna ever reached a densely populated system, every battlefield would become a recruitment station. But even as they planned joint strikes and argued over who would betray whom once Vecna fell, his empire kept spreading in the background. Another derelict here, a forgotten listening post there, a wrecked cruiser in an uncharted shoal, all awakened, stripped, and folded into the network one corpse at a time. On demon worlds, the dark gods watched with something dangerously close to interest. Nurgle felt the insult of souls denied his garden and wondered whether this new thing might be reshaped into a favored plague. Sench delighted in the branching futures that forked wildly around the Caligari expanse. Khorne snarled at the theft of bloody offerings that should have spilled in his name, and Slaanesh savored the unique flavor of mortals held on the edge between life and death, their agony stretched into an instrument. On the Golden Throne, if the Corpse Emperor's scattered consciousness noticed at all, it did so the way a fevered dream registers an itch, distant, blurred, potentially catastrophic if ignored too long. For Meridel, the grand metaphysics mattered less than the aching faces of the sisters who strapped on armor before each mission, knowing they might return under someone else's control, and the knot in her gut whenever Eldar walked her decks, graceful and alien, moving past him-etched bulkheads with the amused tolerance of aristocrats visiting a zealous cousin's house. For Vecna, their moral struggles were an interesting footnote. Where they saw blasphemy and betrayal, he saw the inevitable, that in the face of a threat not bribable by gods or ideology, the squabbling children of the galaxy could either cling to their old hatreds and be harvested piecemeal or hold their noses and form a temporary bulwark. He respected their attempts. They were, in their way, almost as stubborn as he was. But as he stood once more on the indomitable Wrath's bridge, undead officers manning stations with silent precision, the hive mind humming in the warp like a choir of muffled screams turned into a single low note. He extended his awareness across hundreds of light years and felt only opportunity. Battlefields where guard regiments died by the tens of thousands, tyrannid splinter fleets chewing through human and Xenos alike, orc whack, leaving mountains of corpses in their wake, all of it raw. Material waiting to be redirected from entropy without purpose to entropy under management. Death, he reflected, had never been the real problem in any universe. The problem was who owned it. In the worlds he had already broken, gods had claimed death as a final argument, the last word in every conversation. Here, the Chaos Gods and the Emperor vied for the same privilege, their followers shouting that their master alone dictated the terms of endings. He intended to take that last word for himself, to turn the entire 41st millennium into a ledger where every fallen soldier, every plague victim, every sacrifice psyker was not a gift to some distant throne but a line item in his growing balance sheet of power. And somewhere between the light of martyrs, where Meridel knelt in a dark chapel asking a silent emperor for guidance on whether her compromises damned her, and the shifting decks of Uratha's Corsair flagship, where Eldar laughed bitterly about the irony of saving Mon-K worlds to preserve their own dwindling future, Vecna's shadow fell like a slow eclipse, promising that sooner or later, every oath, every prayer, every scream, and every soul would come to the same place, his hands.